go right into the webinar.
Amazing. Awesome. Thanks, Cameron. And big thanks to you, Natalie, for hosting me tonight. It's quite the pleasure to be asked to do that. I've been working with Cam and Natalie for the last few years now on my nose work journey. They've been amazing coaches and mentors to me. So I'm excited to bring all of you guys a little bit of the knowledge that I've learned and kind of put my own little personal twist on some of the stuff that I've been working on with Natalie and Cam. So tonight, we're going to talk about harnessing arousal in the sport detection canine, a topic I didn't even really know a whole bunch about or hadn't even really paid attention to until I got my most current dog. So we'll jump into that here in a second. But a little bit about me. I own a training facility called Canine Development and Testing. That's been open actually just for a year now, but I've been training dogs much, much longer than that. I am a Ford Canine Cognition instructor and a canine sport detection trainer. That's been amazing. If you guys have not ever had the chance to go through Canine Cognition or the CSDT courses, they're really fantastic. Lots of good information there. And I'm super grateful for Cam and Natalie putting out that information for us. I'm also a scent work judge, so Canadian Kennel Club here in Canada and CWAGs, both all levels. I absolutely love judging, probably as much as I love teaching nose work. It's really cool just to see all the teams putting things together and watching things click on the day. I have two lovely animals here, my beasts and arousal addicts, Vimy and Valor. Vimy is my short hair, Valor is my Doberman. Both of them play in the sport of detection in SDDA as well as CKC. I started out about 5 years ago in the sport when I was looking for something besides IGP and competition obedience. That was kind of my background prior to this. And I was totally hooked after taking one local class here. I later branched out and got my very first sporting dog, so my German Shorthair Pointer, Vimy. He's from Versatile Hunting Lines, and when I was looking for a short hair, and Cam was privy to all of my millions of questions about what was the best dog to get for nose work, and so this is what my answer was to get this GSP from Versatile Hunting Lines, and my priority, of course, was to do sport detection with him. And I just assumed that having a dog with really good genetic hunt drive would make my job training him super duper easy. And I can tell you that I was real wrong about that. So these two are distinctly different dogs. Most people would say probably just looking at Valor from the outside that he's low drive and that Vimy is high drive. But we're going to get into a little bit about why that maybe isn't entirely accurate. So what are we going to talk about here tonight? Work my screen. There we go. Okay, so we're going to dive in a little bit to arousal and kind of just make sure we're all on the same playing field with understanding what arousal is. I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about some strategies for arousal. We're going to talk about how to modulate your arousal or do some arousal shifting games, and then finally wrap that up with some progress and practice tips. And then we'll leave some time here at the end of the webinar to do a Q&A. Okay, so we have this lovely little Venn diagram where we have instinct, emotion, and then arousal that sort of lives a little bit in the middle. So arousal is often confused with drive. And I think that's why a lot of times we see these high energy dogs that display what is, in my opinion, arousal for their chosen sports, I should say. And these behaviors can look super sexy because the dogs are like super high energy. They move with a lot of energy. They bring a lot of energy to the work. But oftentimes those dogs can also have a lot of issues with controlling their impulses and their arousal. And so we can see a lot of overlap with the arousal and drive. But what I've experienced, at least, and like I said, these two dogs that I have now definitely have way more arousal than I have ever had in my previous dogs. You can definitely have a dog with plenty of drive and very little arousal. So it's really good to get clear on what we're looking at and really understand what you're seeing when we're talking about arousal. So let's start a little bit with instinct. So instinct is the thing that the dog does that they were bred for, or that they do to stay alive, right? So like chasing rabbits, bird dogs hunt birds, protection dogs bite people, right? So these are the things that the dog is inherently bred for. These are their instincts. Instincts are also considered drive. So you will see a lot of people saying that the dog has a lot of hunt drive, for example. So that's typically where that terminology comes from. One thing that's kind of interesting about instincts that I've at least experienced is that they are not easy to change or eliminate. So if you have a dog that likes to chase rabbits, they're probably going to do that. If you have a bird dog that likes hunting birds, they're probably going to do that despite a lot of measures to try and reduce that instinct. On the other side of things here, we have emotion. So this is kind of where like fear, anxiety, happiness, anger, all of those types of things live in this emotional side of the Venn diagram. We try to change emotion with training, but that's not usually the case. We aren't usually very successful training emotion, but we can condition emotion. And then finally, this is kind of where arousal comes in. So it's sort of the overlap between instinct and emotion. This can come from either the instinct side of things, so prey drive, or emotion like anxiety or something like that is often how we see arousal exhibited. A lot of times, like I said, people mistake arousal for drive, but the dog can have a lot of arousal and no drive whatsoever. Dogs can also have drive without arousal. So one thing to look at when you're looking at, is this arousal or is this drive? I always like to think, is the dog putting energy into something? Is there an objective or a purpose for the energy that they're putting out? So arousal is essentially with no purpose or focus. That's how I look at it. So is your dog just like moving around the area with no real purpose or focus, or are they really driven to be doing something with that energy? When we get into the next slide here, when we talk about symptoms, it'll become a little bit more clear as to why sometimes dogs can have arousal without drive. One thing to kind of note as well about arousal is that it can manifest in different ways. So internal or external arousal or symptoms can be present often in the same dog, but typically you end up having one type of dog. You'll either have a dog that's very external with their arousal manifestation, or you'll have a dog that's very internal with their arousal manifestation. And I happen to have one of each. So Valor is very internal with his arousal manifestation, and Vimy is like, you would not mistake him for an over-aroused dog, right? He's like running around and barking and like big pupils and panting and just like all the things that everyone would be like, yes, that's classic over-arousal. But it's a little bit harder to spot it in the dogs who are quiet and internal about their arousal. But it's even probably more important for those dogs that we're actually understanding that they are in over-arousal, because how we manage that should be more or less the same as how we manage the dogs or train the dogs that are having these external arousal manifestations. A lot of times when we see these like little quiet dogs that are very internalizing with their arousal, we want to kind of like bougie them up and get them really excited. And we say, oh, they need more drive, they need more drive. But like on the inside, they're like maniacs, right? Like that's totally how Valor is. So he's like on the inside, his brain's exploding, but on the outside, he looks super stoic and quiet. So bougieing him up and like getting him all jazzed up for a toy and stuff does not help fix his problems at all. So for those of you with dogs who exhibit symptoms of arousal that are more on the internal side of things, we're not going to have a lot of examples of those types of dogs in this webinar. It's just not quite as common, but keep in mind if that is a dog that you have or a dog that you work with, that a lot of the strategies that we're going to be talking about tonight are going to work the same for whether they are internal or external manifestations. Okay. So some symptoms of arousal. In our sport detection dogs, arousal may look like all of these things: barking, spinning, wide eyes. We always joke with Vimy. We always tell him put his pupils away because his pupils are always like super dilated. He's like super wide eyed. Excessive panting, super common symptom for Vimy as well. Rapid scanning. So this is something that Valor does. He gets like really stoic and he'll just like kind of like look around the environment, and he's not really fixated or distracted by any one thing. He's just rapidly scanning the environment the entire time. A lot of times we have dogs passing hides in the search area, and this can often be due to over-arousal. We can often see also a change in their trained final response. So if you have a trained final response or an indication, oftentimes we will see this criteria either deteriorate, as in the dog is not giving their trained final response or indication, or we might also see there be additional behaviors like aggressive pawing or barking or biting at the hide, things like that. We also see a lot of zoomies with over-aroused dogs, any type of vocalizing, including whining, a lack of focus, and also aimless movement. Vinny's classic aimless movement. He just sort of like tends to just like zip around and he's not really doing anything in particular. So those are just some of the things that I have seen as symptoms in sport detection dogs in particular. I would love to hear from you guys in the webinar chat, what other symptoms you are seeing in your dogs in terms of over-arousal, or what you might think are over-arousal symptoms. So just let me know in the chat box what you guys are seeing.
So nothing has come in besides the one question. If you want to go ahead and answer that one, it's up to you. Do you want to do the one with, there you go.
Oh, chat is disabled. Well, that's unfortunate. What's going on there?
Okay, well, let's see if we can fix this. Well, have people, if instead of the chat, hop into the Q&A.
Yeah, just do it in the Q&A, and then we can, that way I only have to like monitor one chat box also. So that would be super convenient. So
if you want to go ahead and start with Kate's question, and then we'll let any other questions kind of come in. If Chris, you want to add your question into where you just told us about the chat being disabled.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so while I'm answering Kate's question here, you guys go and put ahead in the Q&A what you're seeing for symptoms of over-arousal in your dogs. So Kate says, out of Australia, regarding, she has a question regarding toy distractions and scent work. So dealing with a dog that won't disengage from toy, steals toy, etc. So I guess I probably have a lot of questions to answer that accurately, but I would say that I would just start really back at basics. So maybe the toy is way too high value of a distractor. I would probably want to go back to like a pipe lineup or something like that and do some like really low value distractors and build back up from there in that context before I go and put it into the search area. In Canadian Kennel Club sport detection, we can use toy distractors in the search area. And it doesn't really clarify in the rules whether we have to have it enclosed in like, let's say a container or a drawer somewhere, or if the toy can be out in like the search area, just like sitting there, like a ball, for example, on top of a table. But what I found judging is that when we enclose the distractor in something, it's higher value immediately. So as soon as we put like the chuck it balls, for example, like they get dogs every single time if I put them in a container. But if I just leave it sitting on the floor, then it doesn't seem to have as much appeal to the dogs. So maybe just play around also with whether like having it contained in something or having it out in the open is like higher or lower value to the dog. But really take a step back and take that out of your search, put it back into a lineup and see if you can work the dog through a various level of distractors before going to the highest value toy. Hope that helps. Okay, so people say barking, zoomies, yep, jumping on handler, absolutely. And I didn't add this one, but that's super common. We see it also in pet dogs all the time, as well as sports detection dogs. Aimless moving, barking, awesome. False alerting, interesting, okay. Won't engage with toy after trained final response, interesting, okay. Rapid scanning, biting hide, yes. Not sure if this is arousal or a different issue, but mine will get so excited to work, she will shake in excitement. That's probably arousal, yeah. Shaking, yeah. Marking if outside. Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Okay, those are really good, you guys. I didn't have a lot of those on my list, so I'm really glad that you guys were able to share that. That kind of gives me a good idea of where you guys are at with your dogs and what you're seeing for arousal. All right, I'm going to give you guys
I'll add real quick.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
This is more in regards to the dog that doesn't want to engage with the toy after the trained final response.
Yeah.
And that to me, or the question I would have, and that can come later, I'm just posing it now so people that are watching and listening can think about this. But has the hierarchy of reward test been done for this dog? Yeah. And what was the results of that, both in both categories, food and toy? Because of course, motivation is going to be the biggest thing. Now, motivation can be displayed in a lot of different ways, from like obviously with our spaniels, my spaniel is very much like this. This is why I brought this question caught my attention. So Ammo loves to, he'll get his toy, but then within a few seconds is like, okay, I got it. And he wants to move on and go back to searching, which is one of those webinars coming up next, is where Natalie's going to show how we're using pre-MAC aspects to build more buy-in into the searching game. But with that said, the biggest thing I had to figure out, or what item to use for when he finds something, came down to food for my dog. Even though he loves to play, he's really good with a toy, except for when he's working. When he's working, he gets his toy, he's like, yeah, whatever, because he actually intrinsically loves searching more than anything else. Yeah. And the searching becomes more rewarding for himself. So we just literally shot video yesterday of both Alara and Ammo. When they search, they find odor, they get their whatever their reinforcer is, or her toy, mine, food. And once they get that, then they're allowed to go do some searching that they want to go do, that intrinsically motivating thing. They get to go do that. Now, obviously, I understand within certain circumstances and disciplines in sport, going around searching for things they want to go search for can be not as desired. However, in the training process, we're doing that to build it so then we can build multiple finds into that using a pre-MAC principle. So anyway,
cool. I'm looking forward to that webinar, because I feel like it'll apply a lot to my hunting dog stuff as well that I'm having some troubles with. So, but on that note about the won't engage with toy after train final response, I find that interesting. I probably have about 100 more questions, like you said, but it's interesting that the dog will give their train final response. Because a lot of times I see the behavior chain break down earlier than that, like in that they're like just passing, they're just like not even giving the indication. Like they'll give like a super faint change of behavior, and then they're like, never mind, still searching, and like kind of they just off they go, right?
Yeah. It's a very interesting thing for the whatever the reason is that this happens. And of course, it's going to be unique to dogs. There are common symptoms, as you're describing right here, the barking, spinning, all those things you brought up. That show us these are symptoms of something else in the dog's behavior, intrinsically rewarding type things. Genetics is another big aspect of this. And then really, how do we go about manipulating these things to our benefit to get them, like Michael Ellis would say, more bought into whatever it is that we would like them to be able to go do. So,
Yeah, no, that makes sense for sure. So, okay, guys, good answers. Very, very thought-provoking. So I'm going to give you guys a couple of videos here just to show you quickly of what we're talking about when we say over-arousal in our searches. So let's have a look. This is my very brave friend and fellow nosework instructor and competitor here in Calgary. And her boy tends to suffer a little bit from over-arousal when he gets searching with the barking, as you can see.
Yeah.
The bigger struggle than just the symptom of barking itself is that, of course, now he's passing hides and he's not focused on the job.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Nice. So he did settle into it there, but a really good example of a dog who's a little bit over aroused and barking and getting a little unfocused from his job. The next video is of Vimi's very first scent detection trial. It was earlier this spring, I guess. There's a lot of snow on the ground though, so it won't seem like spring. But you can see he's really doing a lot of great demonstration of aimless running around and showing us a change of behavior at the hide. I knew where it was exactly like the second he passed it because he had a change of behavior, but he didn't give his indication, so I didn't call it. So you guys will see see what he's doing here in this video. So there's just one hide in this one. So he did a little head snap there, came back and worked the area, but doesn't go into his indication. And now he's just mostly just running around. And it looks like he is fairly easy to handle, but for a little dog, he's a very strong boy. So he tends to pull me around all over the place when he gets like that. So he's passed the hide about 4 times now.
You Canadians have it rough in the springtime.
Right. Well, this was February. It wasn't terrible, but. So yeah, it was a really frustrating search because I knew exactly where the hide was, but I couldn't call it without that trained final response. So, but really good illustration of just a dog sort of just aimlessly running around. He mostly wasn't hunting half the time. So. And this final video is just showing a dog whose trained final response starts to deteriorate. He starts to like slap his feet down on things and get kind of like pushy with all the containers. And this is one of his better searches, I will say, in terms of like not messing things up. He has a tendency of just kind of like slamming things around sometimes when he gets frustrated and over aroused. Yeah. And this is a known three number of hides. Yeah. Yeah. All right, so nothing terribly dramatic, but you can see like as you get into the higher levels where you would have an unknown number of hides in any of these searches, that all of a sudden it would be really, really hard to be able to finish an area, right? When your dog's messing around and they're not focused and they're smushing all your containers together. And, so obviously we want to avoid that as much as possible. All right, so let's get into a little bit about the law of arousal. So this little curve that we see here was developed by the psychologists Robert Yerkes and John Dodson in 1908. So it's going way back, and we've been using this arousal theory ever since then. So this law dictates that performance increases with physiological or mental arousal, but only up to a point. So on this axis, on the vertical axis, we have the low performance to high performance. So that could be physical or mental performance. And along the horizontal axis, we have the low arousal all the way to high arousal. And you can see somewhere kind of in the middle here is our best or optimum performance level. So as the arousal comes up to a certain degree, we are increasing our performance. And then as the dog starts to tip over the curve, we get into this stress zone. And this is where we tend to see our performance start to deteriorate, and we start to see some like anxiety behaviors and a lot of the symptoms that we were looking at that last slide, right? That's where you're going to see barking and whining and big pupils and panting and just kind of all the behaviors that are indicative of a dog that's not very comfortable and a little bit stressed out. So simply put, when stress gets too high, performance decreases. One sort of lesser known fact about this curve is that the curve varies based on the complexity and the familiarity of the task. So if task performance, you're looking for good task performance, you want to have arousal levels that are in the middle range. But difficult tasks, it's almost sometimes okay to have arousal that's a little bit lower. And then on simple tasks, it's best to have arousal that's a little bit higher. And so you can kind of see this if you think about your own canine when they're in training situations, and so many people will say, oh, they're bored of that. Maybe it's just that they're not in the right like arousal mode for the task that they're performing, right? So keep that in mind when you see a dog that looks a little bit bored. Maybe we just actually need to raise arousal a little bit so their interest comes up and then their performance will increase. And of course, the opposite is true, where if we are doing easy tasks, we want, sorry. When doing easy task and the dog is stressed, we want to do a more complex task. Oh my God, I am like totally messing this up. Anyways, when we are doing a very complex task, we maybe want to have our arousal a little bit lower so that the dog isn't stressed out. So in this case, arousal matters. So really try and keep this performance curve in mind as we're going through here today, because you want to make sure that you know where your canine is in terms of their best or optimum performance levels.
Yeah, the biggest thing that we have to consider, and this a lot of times falls into breeds, is, let's say, just take a herding breed, Shepherd, Malinois, etc. We can even get into like the border collies and so forth. They will reach a level of arousal that prohibits them from being mentally flexible.
Yeah.
And when we lose that mental flexibility, we then lose what we would typically say are easy type of behavior. So such as searching. We lose the searching because the arousal turns into, sometimes maybe it's visual. Obviously, in the case of containers, they move around and these invoke certain prey type behavior chains.
Yeah.
And then reinforcement history. So let's add the reinforcement history in the past. Let's say the dogs were trained in the beginning stages to go through boxes. And the premise back in the beginning stage was allow the dog to go search through boxes, make sure it's fun, they're getting food, etc. But what we created was a history of boxes moving around, smashing boxes is also fun.
Yeah.
So when stress happens, or over arousal / stress, it becomes fun to move these things around. But then now we're trying to manage it in a lot of different ways. And the management becomes stressful. And then now, again, depending on the dog, we have the arousal levels change. And obviously, when it's competition, it becomes much more difficult to manage it. So now the dog is allowed to do it, which means in some cases it's self-reinforcing, so that it just fosters that behavior and makes it stronger. So you mentioned it earlier where it's super important to work on things in a very controlled environment. The goal, like you're bringing up, is to control the environment, not the dog.
Yeah.
Because we have to work within their arousal states. Some dogs have the opposite end. There's no buy-in. They're not really motivated by much. They just don't really care all that much, or the reinforcing thing isn't that valuable to them to begin with. So because the audience can be a broad spectrum from little to no buy-in to all the way over the threshold, and in most cases, not only is the dog in a state of, let's just call it stress or arousal, so is the human, because of course it's a competition if it's a trial. And now mom or dad is acting really odd. And then that's also getting the dogs worked up. In addition to that, dogs that have a very pack-oriented behavior or reinforcement concept, we run into at a competition or large training events, the dogs are feeding off of each other, especially during waiting periods and so forth. So the anxiety or the arousal levels are starting in the parking lot. So, and many times, and I'm sure you'll probably get to this, we have to start working on that before we even got into the search space, start teaching certain types of management skills to keep that bell curve like you're showing with the Yerkes-Dodson law, how to find what little tweaks we can do. It's hard to give generalizations, but what we want to do is a saying that I used commonly when I was in the SEAL team training, which is calm breeds calm. So for what we'll be sharing up ahead is my dog is allowed to go forward and do the thing, in this case, searching, when it shows me it's in a calmer state of mind. Mm-hmm. Now, I build that away from the search. That happens before I even get to the search area. So now my dog's there. I have to also watch that I don't create habituations, signals, or cues that tell them, ooh, the best thing is coming. And in some cases, we have done that. We've already built, because it's important to us, because if we do multiple sports, or we're putting on a harness or putting a leash, they're like, ooh, I know what's coming next. And then they just go, they go up.
And in some cases, those cues can be helpful for the dogs.
Absolutely.
To need them, right?
Absolutely.
But for the dogs who are already spinning up before you get to the start line and you're bringing out all their exciting equipment, then yeah, it's not working in their favor.
Yeah, many of those dogs, I actually have them reduce some of the signals and cues, so that way the dog is less likely to know. Or if they do those things, then I give a cooling down period from when they put the thing on. Let's say it's a collar, a harness, long leash, whatever it is, and they go do something else. And then they kind of just drift into the search area before the dog even knows that it happened. But when we go to a start line and we do all these cues, like, when we were in Switzerland, it was the handlers would go un, do, trois, and they would do, 1, 2, 3, and then the dogs would load while they were counting. And that was already getting the dog out of the optimal performance and being out of that mental flexibility to deal with whatever's going on in the environment.
Yeah. Yes, that all makes sense. Thank you for that. So I think that's kind of it on the Yerkes-Dodson law here. Let's move on to the next slide. All right, so yeah, we kind of covered a little bit of this already, but just think about learning and performance. So, over arousal, you're just not going to be able to think clearly. You're not going to be able to learn. You're not going to be able to perform if you're on that far side of the curve. So you want to really keep that in mind for both yourself and for your canine. Like anyone who's ever gone to a seminar or a workshop and you've been nervous, you know how that performance pressure is already increasing your arousal, right? So the same exact thing is happening, just like Cameron said, at the trial. As soon as you get to the start line, the dogs are all feeding off of each other. They're feeding off of you, and that's already impairing your dog's performance. One thing that I want to mention, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this as we get into some of the strategies, but some high arousal dogs can actually get worse with exercise alone. So some people use exercise as a strategy prior to a trial, but like I know with my particular short hair, if you just go throw the ball for him, he's just like a cortisol junkie. Like he'll just be like hanging off the chandeliers, right? So exercise alone isn't necessarily the cure for high arousal. You might have a tired dog, but that doesn't mean that their arousal state has come down at all. Also, some dogs function really well in a high state of arousal. We've all seen that Malinois or that German Shepherd, or in my case now with a short hair, just do really, really well. Like their baseline level of arousal and their performance is really quite high compared to the average dog. But that doesn't mean that we should always train them and always trial them in that zone just because they can function at that level, right? Cortisol is a thing, stress hormones are a thing, adrenaline is a thing, and that's all stress related. So even though they're doing something that they really love to do, that over time is going to take the toll on the dog, right? So we don't always want them living and training and trialing in the red zone there. And then for many dogs, learning to be calm and in the optimum state of arousal is just not part of their nature. My short hair definitely lives in a 6 out of 10 as far as arousal. I think when he's sleeping, he's maybe a 4 out of 10, right? So a lot of dogs are just like this, but we need to find strategies to help them manage their arousal a little bit. All right, so know your canine. A lot of times before I had some of these dogs myself, I was like, oh, it's just, it's just a training problem. But over the last 20 years or so, I've trained in IGP, Mondio Ring, competition obedience, and now sport detection. And these are kind of the last 6 working dogs that I've had in these different sports. And I'm sure that you could probably all take a guess at who or which one of these dogs suffers from the most over arousal and probably be wrong. Spoiler alert, it was not my Malinois. He was actually super mentally flexible and really clear-headed and really had strong drive for the work, but had a really nice off switch and didn't kind of get carried away. So it may surprise you that the 2 current dogs that I have right now, my Doberman and my short hair, are probably the hardest I've actually owned in terms of managing arousal. My German Shepherd was also probably pretty close to them, but these 2 have definitely been the struggle. Yeah, so there's a significant, and Cam was just saying this, is a significant genetic component to arousal. So I guess I just want to leave you guys with the idea that like it's part of who your dog is. This probably, might have been, there might be contributing factors as to why your dog might be over aroused, but it's probably a lot of it's just genetic. It's who your individual is. And don't beat yourself up over it if you're dealing with over arousal, because it happens to a lot of these working breeds. We're breeding dogs to be really high level, high energy, highly intense dogs. And so arousal just sort of comes hand in hand with these types of things. All right, so whether you have a pet, working, or performance canine, you got to know your canine, right? You got to know your dog's arousal triggers, and you have to know their optimal performance zone. All of this knowledge will really benefit you. So I kind of just laid out, I really like to look at this like from a visual scale perspective. Like the curve is really nice, but what I really want to look at is what are the things that trigger my dog into an aroused state, and what is that level of arousal on a scale. So looking at it from like a 1 to 10, you can see that like when Vimi's relaxing, he's not even really super relaxed. Like he's kind of just like sitting there, like waiting to see what's going to happen. Decompression walks are pretty low on the arousal scale for him, so that kind of helps calm him down and like gets his like sniffing going and gets like the olfaction happening in a way that's going to be calming for him. Eating food is even starting to move him up the scale a little bit. Handler pressure, affection, chasing food, so things that are moving are obviously going to increase his arousal a little bit. And I would say like on a good day, he probably lives somewhere in this like 6 out of 10 in terms of arousal. That's probably like his like engaged work, right? But as we start to move up that scale, which like does not take very long for a lot of these dogs that are really easily over aroused, you can see that like just the littlest things kind of tip him into over arousal. So if he has to wait, any type of lack of direction. So if I just like release him from an exercise and just like don't give him any further direction, he gets super upset, like barking, over aroused, running around, like super big pupils, panting, like he just is super uncomfortable with that. And anytime I ask him to offer behaviors, I think he likes this aspect of it, but the arousal is still the same in that he really like peaks up in arousal as soon as I start asking him to offer anything to me. As we move up the scale here a little bit more, other dogs, his fear of missing out is a significant factor and kind of contributing to his arousal. Any sort of frustration in training can really, he'll start barking and jamming out of training really quickly because he's now just running around. Toys and tugging are probably like a 9 out of 10. Retrieving sends him over the top. So I have to be super careful about that. And any sort of physical play with the handler, with myself, he gets quite over aroused quite quickly about that. And then environmental stuff like wildlife, obviously, like he's a bird dog. So like there's nothing more reinforcing to him than a bird. And then also a lack of decompression. So he really needs a ton of decompression, and this does not look like going out to a field throwing a ball for him. He just needs to like be out like in the world sniffing and moving his body and that sort of stuff. And that really has a cumulative effect for him. So I see that on a day where he would normally be able to manage some of these things and not slip into over arousal and kind of be unmanageable in that respect and not really like have his thinking brain on. In the case of having a lack of decompression exercise, he can really wind up super quickly. And so, 1 or 2 days of missing out on that is okay. We can get away with that. But if you start pushing it into, 5, 6, 7 days, then I'm really starting to see the impact of that on his arousal levels. My mouse is stuck here. What's going on? All right. So I'm going to jump into some strategies for how we can help teach our canines to deal with arousal. So like Cam was saying earlier, like context really matters. And I think like we're not going to get into a big training discussion today about like setting up your environment and like how to break down your exercises. What I want to give you guys are just some really tangible things that you can do with your dog that are going to happen before you start searching with your dog. So if you're already in the middle of the search, it's like you kind of like you're already redlining, you're probably already like out of that peak performance zone. Sometimes it's just better to abort mission and get out of there. But these strategies are going to be things that you can be doing before you even start your search. So how you're waiting in the staging area, how you're coming up to your start line, how you're even working in between exercises with your dogs. These are the types of strategies that I want to share with you guys today to try and help you guys have an understanding of how to modulate your canine's arousal. So it's not about like snuffing it down and having no arousal, because we need that, right? You guys saw that curve earlier, like we need to have our dog in an optimum level of performance, but we want to be able to modulate that up or down based on our needs, based on our dog in that day, based on the complexity of the exercises, the training setup, all that kind of stuff. So that's what these strategies are going to address for you. So decompression is not necessarily a training strategy, and I'm only just going to mention this for a moment, but it can have significant impact on your dog's arousal alone. So with Vimy, if he does not have the opportunity to just like go be a dog and like sniff and move his body in nature without obedience and like rules and all that kind of stuff, like he just needs to go and like do his dog thing, then he is really, really challenging to manage. And so when we're not meeting the needs of our dogs, the rest of the training can be a lot more challenging. So I challenge you guys to just kind of look at what your dog's needs are in terms of decompression and see if you can increase that a little bit, to see if you are able to provide them with a little bit more opportunity to kind of just like move their body in nature and decompress by using their nose, right? We know how powerful sniffing is for our dogs. So trying to increase that opportunity for them that isn't in a scent work environment. One thing to kind of keep in mind about this is don't substitute decompression with jogging, biking, fetch, things like that. That is not decompressing to our dogs. That's like creating cortisol and adrenaline and all that kind of stuff. And it's not going to be restorative for our dogs. And I use this typically daily, if not several times a week, maybe more, but definitely pre-trial. So one thing I've learned recently with Vimy, and he's quite young, so he's only just been trialing a few times, but the last trial we were at was a 3-day trial, and I was hosting the trial with one of my trial hosts partners, and we were there like pretty much all day Friday evening setting up. So we had no exercise. Saturday, he searched really well. He had beautiful searches. I was really, really happy with everything that he did that day. Sunday, we were entered in the same level and he was a nightmare. And I thought, well, everything went so well on Saturday. Like, what's happened? The only thing that's changed is just him being in that stressful environment, like with the other dogs, just kind of feeding up off all the other dogs' arousal, probably my arousal and my stress levels, and also a lack of just his ability to go out and move his body. So it was really a big eye opener to me that this definitely needs to be part of our pre-trial routine as much as possible. Okay, so the next strategy, and I've used this a lot, is platforms. These can be a great tool for managing arousal. They're super easy to teach. They're pretty accessible. They're pretty portable. And I just find that they really help anchor the dog and give them some context for what they're supposed to be doing. And they can be super, super calming if you create a good conditioned emotional response to the platform. So essentially I teach this just by having the dog offer to come up on the platform, feeding them there, maybe doing a treat toss to go off the platform and reset them, having them come back up onto it, feeding them 3, 4, 5 times on the platform, just like nice, slow feeding, nice and calm, right? As your dog starts to understand that the platform has value, typically what you're going to see is that you can't even like get it down on the ground and your dog's going to be magnetized to that platform. That's when you know that your dog's ready to use this platform in the context of some training scenarios. One thing to kind of keep in mind as you're adding this into your training is that you want to make sure that your dog totally understands what they're supposed to be doing on that platform. So for me, my criteria means that you just sit quietly on the platform and you eat some food. That's the only thing that I'm asking them to do on that platform. I give myself lots of distance from distractions when I'm using this. So I want to set up my training environment so that my dog isn't being over aroused also by the environment, when the training itself is probably fairly complex for the dog at that moment. So I don't want to add in any environmentals. But if there are some environmentals there that are bothering your dog or they're getting a little bit over aroused by them, just give yourself lots of distance from them. And then when you're using the platform in your training, a couple things to look for are monitoring of the scanning. So like with my Doberman, for example, he will like very much be scanning the environment the whole time that we're out training. And if I can get him settled enough that he stops scanning, that to me is a cue that, or a clue, I should say, that he's probably in a better frame of mind and he's probably ready to start his search. If I try to start his search before he's finished scanning and looking around, I'm not going to have a dog. He's just going to be busy looking around, right? And the other sort of factor to look at is how your dog is taking food. So if they're snatching and like biting at your fingers, they're probably still a little bit too jazzed, right? So a lot of times you'll want to like wait for a dog that's going to be able to take food at least reasonably calm. Like it's all relative. If you have a sharky dog, you know, less sharky than what's normal is what you're looking for on the platform. So you want a dog that's calmly taking food, not like sharking it out of your hands and making your fingers bleed. And then take your platform to as many new places as possible. So the platform itself becomes a cue, like I said. And when I was working on changing the search environment for my dogs, I would always bring the platform into the picture to give them a context of what they were supposed to be doing when we got there. So obviously this is something that you're going to want to fade out over time, but it really helped keep my dogs nice and calm while they were learning the idea of searching in new environments. And they weren't becoming like crazy and over the top, over aroused about things, because I could easily just place them back onto the platform as soon as I saw things starting to escalate a little bit and then bring them back down a little. So just really make sure that if you are using this in your training, that you're not asking for work if your dog is still scanning, refusing food, snatching food, or if they can't remain calmly on the platform. If my dog wants to dart around all over the place off the platform, I'm not going to be fighting with that in my training session, right? I'm just going to be taking that outside of my training session again and building up some more value for the platform and seeing if my dog can just simply sit there and eat food in the environment. So that's kind of my criteria. Like I mentioned, I've been using this a lot just in like new context. So if I'm changing the context in the search area, I'll bring my platform back in. But I also use it at start lines quite a lot. I find especially for those really excitable dogs that just want to go blasting into the search area, in addition to just using hide placement to help teach that, I find that using the platform helps kind of bring them down a little bit, gives them a little bit more focus right off the start line. So then you're able to actually practice the good behaviors that you're looking for on the start line versus having to manage your dog or block them with a leash or whatever the case may be. I also really like using this strategy just stationing between my reps. So with Vimy, I mentioned that he just starts to ramp up as soon as there isn't any direction. So if I just like leave him loose in the training area, he'll literally just be like running around barking in a circle. So if I put him on a station between our reps, then I can think about what I'm doing and reset my hides or move my containers or whatever. And he's not practicing all of that over aroused behavior in the meantime. And then just recovery from over arousal. So if my dog does kind of like slip into over arousal in our training session, I can quickly bring him back here, do some slow feeding on the platform and kind of just get him refocused before I start another rep. If I see that my dog is slipping into over arousal and then I start a new search with him or a new training task, then that's going to all leak into my training as well. So I just use the platform to just kind of bring him back and center him. All right. The next strategy is a food scatter. So these are really straightforward. I think everyone probably knows a food scatter, right? You take a handful of food, you throw it down into the ground, super duper easy. These don't necessarily need to be taught, but they do need to be practiced. So I find some dogs that are in over arousal, depending on where they are on the scale, they won't put their heads down to eat food. So this needs to be sort of practiced in a low distraction, low arousal environment so that when, like I say, scatter. So when I say scatter, my dog knows to put their nose down. It's like a habit at this point that they need to put their nose down and they need to eat the food. I find that this is generally a low arousal activity for most canines, but you got to know your dog the best here. So if this isn't a low arousal activity for your dog, maybe, consider doing something else. We'll have more strategies for you guys. But generally sniffing is calming. So if you're finding that this isn't a calming activity for your dog, check a few things. So maybe make sure that you're using it on like a substrate on the ground that like isn't going to allow for the food to roll around everywhere. So like don't put it on concrete and have your treats rolling around all over the place because that's not going to be very calming. The idea with this food scatter is that we want the dog sniffing and like working for their food. So find surfaces that are better for that. So like grass and things like that will be a lot better than obviously on a concrete parking lot. If you don't have that, or if you're indoors, consider using a snuffle mat. So those are easy to pack with you. You can bring that to your training area or a parking lot or wherever it is that you're training, and you can use a snuffle mat in between your reps instead of doing the platform, or in addition to using the platform, right? I also find using lower value treats in this exercise is really helpful for those dogs who might get a little bit over aroused about higher value food. So pretty much use the lowest value food that you possibly can in this scenario. So that might be your dog's kibble or something like that. But if they'll work for that in the parking lot, then you know that their arousal is probably low enough that they can just, sit there and eat from the snuffle mat or from the scatter on the ground. And also play around with single or continuous scatters. So sometimes I'll just give my dog one scatter and that's probably enough for them. But some dogs, I have some dogs in our day training program right now, just not even from a scent work perspective, but just pet dog behavior. They are not calm after they've eaten one scatter. So those dogs need a continuous scatter until I start to see their arousal come down, and then they can move on to a different task. So if you need to, just continue dumping food down into that scatter until you see your dog decompress a little bit. One thing to kind of keep in mind here is that you don't want to add motion to the food. So don't throw the food. Don't use treats that are rolling all over the place. You just want them to just hit the ground and sit there. A couple places that you could probably use this. So definitely in the staging area. So if you are, staging in multiple different areas at a trial, this is something that you can do in between those waiting areas. Especially if you're outdoors, those are really nice. Indoors, it gets a little bit more challenging to use this strategy. But if you can bring a snuffle mat with you up until kind of the second last staging area or something and just leave it outside, that's always an option also. And I do find also that this is a really great option just to acclimate to new areas. So if I am taking my dog to a new area, this is especially good for my Doberman because he's just so much about the scanning. So he'll often not be able to eat from a snuffle mat or from a treat scatter when I bring him into a new area. So that's kind of my test to see whether he's kind of low enough arousal that he can just eat this food off the ground. And then I'll just do that in a bunch of new areas just to get him sort of with his nose down and sniffing and calming down versus with his head up and looking around all over the place. All right, that one's pretty straightforward. So moving on from lower arousal food scatter, we can also use food to do a food toss. This is actually one of my favorite strategies. It seems to work for a ton of different dogs. Lots of my students will do this, and it will lower or increase arousal depending on the dog. And surprisingly, this actually does need to be taught. As many dogs don't track food at first. So you really need to get in there and start by putting the food right on your dog's nose. And I use the word get it or the cue get it, put the food right on the dog's nose, toss the food away and just a little ways and have them chase it. And then as soon as they orient back to you, I'll show them the food again and say, get it, and send it out in the other direction. So it's a little bit like bowling. That's kind of what I liken it to. But yeah, you want to make sure that your dog knows to track the food and that they can go out and track that food and find it immediately versus getting out there and being all confused and wondering where the food is. So as you increase the speed and the distance of your tosses, the dog will kind of get into the game a little bit more, and the faster and further you toss, the higher the arousal will become for most dogs. So if I need to kind of wake my dogs up a little bit after they've come out of their crates and I need to kind of get them awake and moving a little bit, I might warm them up with a little bit of a food toss. It doesn't create too much handler engagement, so it's something that I can safely do to just bring my dog's arousal up a little bit without, having them be focused on me and trying to give me eye contact and engagement and stuff like that. In this case, also try to use lower value foods. So you don't want the dog to be crazy for the reinforcer. This isn't going to be their 10 out of 10 reinforcer, right? I like to use something easy that the dogs can see, like cheese strings or something like that, but not too crazy reinforcing. Make sure that you stop the game if your dog is not focused on chasing the food. So a lot of times what I see with my Doberman is he'll he'll go out and like half-heartedly chase the food. And if I keep at it, he'll kind of tap out of the game. He'll typically start like, scanning the environment again or doing something like that. So don't use this strategy if that's what's happening. Safety is always really paramount here too. So that's one big reason you don't want them scanning the environment and then having them go off and chase something else. So just make sure that when you're doing this, that you're stopping the game if your dog isn't engaged in the game, and that you're doing it in a super safe area so that your dog can't run off. A couple uses for this that I have employed with my own dogs is in the staging areas. So while we're waiting, this is a super fun game to play with the dogs, just to kind of keep their energy at like a medium level. I don't want them quite at their performance level yet, but I don't want them napping either. So this is something that I'll do to kind of just keep them moving and active a little bit. I definitely do this between reps. So usually like as part of like my reinforcement strategy, I will, maybe play with some toy and then bring my dog down a little bit by doing some food tosses and then bring them to the platform. So I'm kind of working my dog down from that high value reinforcer with the food toss a little bit between reps. Again, I'll use this often to acclimate to new areas, especially for my Doberman. He's not the type of dog that needs to just go for a walk around an area because he's just fixated on everything the entire time. So I like him to spend time in the environment, but not necessarily be looking at the environment. And then this is one strategy that I use for recovery from over or under arousal. So if my dog's getting a little bit too high with some toy play, I don't necessarily want to end the game and I don't want his arousal to be at 0, but I might switch from toy to food toss so that, there's still that like prey aspect of the reinforcement, and he can still do some chasing, and he's got good energy, but it's not like crazy over arousal like he would have for the toy. I think that's it on the food toss. It's a really fun one. Honestly, as so many of my clients love this one and their dogs really do quite well with it. All right. And then we have tricks for the dogs that love shaping and offering behaviors. Typically, I have a couple low and a couple high arousal tricks that I can do with my dogs to kind of bring them up or down kind of on that arousal scale. Vimmy's low arousal trick is a sustained nose touch, which you see in the picture there, which honestly took me months to teach him because he's almost never low arousal enough to actually perform that behavior. But now that we have it on cue and stimulus control, he's actually pretty good with it. And his high arousal tricks are spin and twist. So I try not to have too much handler engagement before I go into a search area. So if you do choose tricks that have a lot of handler engagement, I might not use those at my start line. So I don't necessarily want the dog looking at me. I want them to be able to respond to cues, but not necessarily have to perform the trick with me in the picture. And then the movement of the tricks dictates the arousal level. So to some degree, the intrinsic motivation of the dog will also be a factor here. So like Vimy really loves movement and movement makes his arousal higher. And he also finds movement really reinforcing. So that spin and twist can actually get him pretty high. Like I have to be a little bit careful that I'm actually not overdoing those tricks with him because he'll actually just like continue to feed off of it and his arousal will build as he performs those and as there's more movement. So I do need to be really careful that I'm not kind of pushing him over the edge with that. So you just kind of need to know your dog a little bit on this one and know whether the movement entices arousal or whether it just kind of brings them into a reasonable level. And also know whether your dog has a propensity for handler focus and maybe don't use this at the start line or at least use it maybe in a strategic way. And I definitely use these types of things in staging areas as well. Like I want my dog kind of like ready to focus, but not necessarily super engaged with me. So I might do a couple spins and twists as we're kind of walking up to the start line and then get him ready to go from there. So that's typically where I'm using this. And of course, I use it in recovery from over or under arousal. So if I need to bring them up, I'm going to do some tricks. And if I need to work them down, maybe that's kind of halfway through my cycle of reinforcement. And I might add some tricks in there to just start bringing them down from like tugging and running and playing and that sort of thing. So again, a little bit depends on the dog and how intrinsically motivating they find these tricks. All right, so let's talk about arousal shifting strategies. So it's all great to have all of these strategies, but you have to, and this is something that really like Natalie really imparted on me when we were doing our coaching, especially like last year, I was working on so much stuff with arousal with Vimy and it was super frustrating because I would work on all these strategies and then I would go do searches with them and like none of the pieces were coming together. And so what it really turns out to be for him, and this is what we've been using with a lot of my students now, is that we need to create this opportunity to move through arousal. So from going like low, medium, high, medium, low, and kind of bouncing back and forth between those arousal levels, and then putting them into the searches. So what I was just like, going from like a ball play to a search. Well, it was like a nightmare. Like he wasn't really searching well at all. So what I needed to do was teach him how to go like high to low in like context outside of searching, and then start to bring some of those strategies together into the search area. So that's kind of how I started creating all of this arousal shifting with him. And it's really helped us a lot in terms of getting his head in the game. And it's almost now like he has the context for these games because I use them almost exclusively before we search. So he almost knows now, and he gets pretty focused on his job. So the games that we're playing here in themselves have context for him for the searching, and instead of like putting him over the edge like a toy would, and tugging and chasing and all that kind of stuff, these seem to kind of give him a little bit more focus. But I like to place these strategies along the same scale that I put his triggers, so that if my canine is a 10 on the arousal scale, I'm not going to be super successful, likely starting with my platform, right? If my dog's already totally redlining, asking him to sit calmly and quietly and eat food on a platform might be a little bit challenging for a lot of dogs. So I really want to make sure that I'm starting where my dog is at in terms of their arousal. So if my dog is at a 10, I might need to do a little bit of tugging or toy play with him or handler play in order to kind of bring him down off the ledge a little bit. And then maybe I'm going to work my way down from there and do some spins and twists, which he really finds motivating, and they're fairly like high arousal for him. And then maybe I'll move into a food toss, and then maybe a food scatter, and then finally my platform. So in that way, I'm kind of like working him down the arousal scale. We'll talk a little bit in a minute about how we work them back up that scale. But, if you have a dog that's like already like 10 out of 10 on the arousal scale, and you're asking them to do something super calm and quiet, that can be quite a challenge for dogs. And it's, arousal is not a tap. They don't just like turn it off, right? So sometimes we need to like have it trickle down a little bit before we have a dog that's ready to kind of start another rep and be in a learning frame of mind again. All right, so now that we have a few strategies for raising or lowering arousal, and your dog is proficient with them, which is super important. So remember that you want to make sure that your dog understands all of these games before you start putting them into their work. But now that they have that done, you want to be able to just add that into these little arousal shifting games so that you can practice moving up and down the arousal scale with your dog. So you kind of need to observe your dog in the moment. So is he low, medium, or high arousal? And what is his normal baseline? For Vimmy's normal baseline is like a 6 or a 7. Like that's just like how he lives all the time. And so I'm not going to probably like start with a 2 on his arousal scale, right? So I want to make sure that when you're looking at your dog, you understand where they're at for their baseline, and then you pick something, one of these strategies that's going to be close to their baseline on one side or the other. And then you're just going to practice bringing them up and bringing them down by playing these games. And I'm going to show you what that might look like here. So these little cycles are kind of just like the little games that I have played with Vimy. And so I started like the one on the upper right here, is with no searches. So I wanted to make sure that he could cycle through all of these arousal games before I put it into the search area. So I maybe start him on his platform, and then I would do a food scatter, and then a food toss, and then a food scatter, and back to the platform. Or maybe I would do a food toss and then some toy play, which is like super high arousal for him. I don't even have that as a strategy on here because frankly, you're not really like managing your dog's arousal. It's usually just an outlet for them at that point. But I might do a little bit of toy play and then back to a food toss, back to a platform, something like that, right? So I'm using that whole scale of arousal strategies that are relevant to my dog and kind of just moving him up and down and up and down. And that's the first part of it before you even try to put this into a search at all. And then, so when I first started doing this in the searches, I started like super easy, right? So my search was like really low complexity, a familiar environment. Like I'm not asking for any really hard skills. I'm not even really asking for like his trained final response in that case. I just want to know, like, can you move through these arousal strategies and still do a little search? So I'd start on his platform and I would do a bit of a food toss, maybe a couple tricks like a spin and a twist, and then I would send him to search. That was sometimes too much, right? So you kind of have to just like look at what your dog's giving you in the moment and understand whether that was better or worse than their normal arousal baseline, and then just sort of change it from there, right? So for Vimy, this strategy does not work very well. He's usually better starting from like a platform or a food toss in order to go into searching, but that doesn't really mimic the real life feel of arousal, like at the trial when everyone's stressed and there's all the dog energy and everything. So finally, I worked up to being able to do some toy play and then send him into a search, and then do some toy play as a reinforcement and then send him directly back into searching. And I almost predominantly use food in my training with him because the toy is so high arousal for him and it's very highly reinforcing for him. So I don't tend to use the toy in the middle of my searches very often. But this was actually something that Natalie really encouraged me to work on with him, because he is already so like far on the spectrum of arousal in the base case, that I needed to be able to mimic some of that in my training in order for him to understand how to work through that arousal when it came to a trial. So this strategy has really worked really well for us, where we basically just like pick like a medium to high arousal activity on the scale, and then do a little search, and then another high arousal activity, and then a search. So it doesn't always have to be their like 10 out of 10. Like they don't always have to work in that realm, but eventually you want to work up to that, right? So that's going to be like your worst case scenario at a trial, typically, is when your dog's like at their like 9 or 10 out of 10, right? So these are some of the games that I would just play, like I said, away from the search at first, and then adding just like really like simple searches into it. And then the next video I'm going to show you here is just a very simple arousal shifting game that I played with Vimy. And he, like, just the sight of containers, Cam mentioned this earlier, just like the context, right? The arousal of the containers themselves creates more arousal. And so then he like wants to push things around and step on them with his feet. And so we really struggle with his arousal in containers. And frankly, we still do. Like, I think that's going to be like a never ending, training piece for us, is kind of just managing his arousal, because as soon as he like sees the visual of the containers, he's already like starting to amp up. And I do think that part of that is just the complexity of it for him. He finds them hard, and so he's already feeling a little bit of stress about it, and that manifests into like this over arousal situation. So I tend to practice a lot of my arousal games on the container searches, because I typically don't have as much of an issue in interiors and exteriors with him. All right. Oh, I don't know what's happening here. There we go. So you can see I'm starting them from a platform here. And the criteria was super low. I was just looking for a tiny little freeze there. I wasn't really even like looking for a long duration on his indication. And then feeding him some food before I release him to search again. Knocking over the pylon, the container, it's a mess. And then at the end of that rep, I play with his toy. So I typically don't play with his toy at that stage of his training in between the container resets, but I have worked up to that now. So I can now release him to a toy, play with him, put him back on the platform, kind of cool him down a little bit. I don't even really need to feed him anymore on the platform. If I just put him on the platform, that's like cue enough now that he starts to kind of have that emotional regulation. He kind of comes down a notch a little bit, and then I can start my next rep. Okay. All right. So just a little bit about progress and practice. Like, you know, this is all, it's all a work in progress, guys. You are going to probably be managing arousal for like the lifelong training career of your dog, That's just the reality when you own these high drive dogs that have been bred to be very also high arousal. Again, depending on your breed. So you might have a breed that's just very genetically programmed to be this way. And that's just the reality. It's not a bad thing, but you just need to be thinking about it as you go into your training. Some tips that I'm going to leave you guys with is choose your environments for training wisely. I always joke that we have like the white padded room in the basement for Vimy. So like every time I'm training them a new context, new skill, whatever it is, if I'm changing a variable in my training, I tend to basically take it to the basement where it's super quiet, really low arousal, and teach them there and then keep everything nice and calm. I don't start these techniques or change any training variable where my dog's going to be highly aroused in the base case, right? So don't try this at a trial for the first time because you're not going to know what the results are going to be. Your dog's going to be super jazzed, right? So really pay attention to what's going on in your training environment because that will support your dog's arousal a lot. Find and use what works for your canine. Some strategies may not work for you, and that is totally okay. I do find that the platforms and the food tosses for most of my client dogs work really, really well. The dogs just pick up on it. It seems to be really clear for the dogs what the context is, and they can regulate themselves by playing those games fairly quickly. But you just got to find what works for you guys. Always remember to meet your dog where they're at. So you're not going to take your dog from an 8 out of 10 and make them a 2 out of 10 immediately, right? That takes a little bit of time. It takes practice moving up and down this arousal scale. And some dogs just are never going to be a 2 out of 10. So you just kind of have to meet your dog where they're at and work from there. And sometimes you just have to abort mission and get the hell out of Dodge, right? So if you can't get your dog where you need them to be and they're not able to work, don't continue training. Don't train in that place all the time with your dog. We need to teach them to manage it, yes, but we don't want to fill our training sessions with a whole bunch of junk reps where our dog's just totally over aroused and not in the learning state of mind. Sometimes you just need to get out. And there's no shame in enlisting help, right? There's so many great, amazing trainers out there that have a good eye. And sometimes just having someone else give you their opinion on something can be super helpful just to shed some light on where you're at. So, just reach out for help if you ever need anything. Even a fellow trainer or a competitor or something will often be able to give you a little bit of insight on what they see, because when we're so close to the topic, we don't often have the knowledge or the emotional bandwidth to deal with the problems at hand when it's our own dogs, right? So I think that's it, guys. That's all I have for you. I will open it up to some questions now if you guys have anything that you want me to clarify or elaborate on.
And what I'll do is as they send any questions in, if they have any, I will hit a few like little talking points that I was making notes of as you were doing
please. That would be awesome. I'd love your feedback.
Yeah. So one of the biggest things that, as handlers of the dogs, one of the most critical things, and you brought it up in different ways, but I want people to think about, can the handler of the dog identify what is the trigger that causes the arousal?
Yeah.
A lot of them know what it looks like, but do you know what that antecedent is? Do you know what that thing is that happens before? Yeah. Because as soon as you understand what the thing is, what the trigger is, then you're going to be able to be much more successful at communicating to the dog how to manage this. Because the goal I always joke around is you got to catch it when it's a spark, not a fire.
Yeah.
And most people see it when it's a fire and haven't identified what that spark is. Yeah. So most importantly is whatever your dog is, whatever the arousal level is, are you able to identify it beforehand? And then once you do, now how can you be ahead of it? And again, these are some of the things you brought up. There's different things that you can do, but the most important is once I identify what is the trigger, what is the antecedent, what is the thing that's happening before my dog goes into arousal. Like you said, sometimes it can be the area. Sometimes it's the signals that are given to my dog. Sometimes it's just the drive there. The dogs, like you said, if you train in a frequent training area, the dogs, many people know, I can relate to this. The dogs know when you get home. They know about 3 streets away before you get home. The activity in the car changes, the dog excitement level goes up. So that means they know either certain bumps, certain turns, certain things that cause the dog to go, ooh, I know what's going to happen next. And again, When it's a training area or the area they get to go have fun in, this is the antecedent. This is what that is. So we have to figure out what can break that cycle so that way I can show them a new desired behavior that still gets them what they want, but done so through a calm way. Now, again, what this is going to be different for a lot of dogs, but the most important thing I implore all of the handlers and trainers to pay attention to is what or can you identify what that trigger is? And then once you have that, you've beaten half the problem. Now, many times, like we talked about, it's that context generalization aspect. It's the boxes for a lot of dogs.
Yeah.
It's the waiting at the line. And like you mentioned, one of the techniques is using of a place board of some type, the Cato board. A lot of people know Simon Prinz. He's been an advocate for that. He uses it for a slightly different reason, but the bonus is because that also helps that. The aspect of that, though, for some dogs, going to the Cato board becomes the trigger. So in order, no matter what it is that we're working on, we have to work on it away from the detection aspect. Because if we can work on it away from the detection aspect, that allows us to do it with little to no bleed over to our odor work. If we try working on it, like you mentioned, in the middle of your training or in the search itself, we risk potential negative connection to the detection aspect. So we want to lower a lot of the lower a lot of the variables, what I meant to say, lowering the variables down to a very simple, identifiable context for you, the human, to go, it's A or B. This is what's causing it. This is how I can go about fixing it. And then bring that, once you've got that worked out and it's not necessarily associated to odor, then we can try it slowly to odor, but in a very simple variable or context. So that way we can get success that way.
Yeah.
Again, I would love to give specifics, but then I'd have to go into each specific one, like barking, and then why is the barking happening? And then zoomies, why the zooming is happening. We will cover some of this in an additional webinar, the one that we're talking about, the pre-max skills that Natalie will be doing. But that's where we'll show some of the pre-max principle. And then again, this is our case. Our dogs love to go search for what they want, not necessarily what we want, but it is just change that out for barking, change that out for zoomies, change that out for whatever you want. You can pre-mac a lot of this through, do this, get this, do this, get this. And then you start building it out further and further apart. And then it becomes more of the actual behavior that we want, which is cool, calm, collected. And like I said earlier, calm breeds calm. So I don't see any questions. So I'm assuming,
money, guys.
Yeah. So, here we go. There you go. You go ahead and read it.
I don't see any new ones. Do you?
Oh, okay. So the new one just came in.
Oh, I see it.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I can read that. So recommendations to lower arousal for dogs who aren't superfood motivated. Her motivation is dramatically lost if no toy reward is present and her interest goes away. She loves to search and gets too over aroused and goes so fast her brain and nose aren't always on the same page. So you want to lower her arousal, and she's not superfood motivated.
Yeah, so for me, what I was going to say is this is one where having a variable reward buy-in helps out tremendously.
Yeah.
So like she said, the dog isn't really super motivated for food, but food can then lead to the toy, or the, first find ends with a toy and then we're just done for X amount of minutes or time until the dog calms back down. And then we go to the other one. What this usually tells me is the dog gets more excited as each rep happens. So this is a dog that it's quality over quantity right now.
Yeah.
It's the one and done, and then come back and do one and done again. I understand that obviously when we're doing sport, there's multiple finds, but we need to go back to the less is more concept to reestablish the desired behaviors. Now, once we start moving to multiple hides, then I'm going to introduce, and I've done this already, in this system where I'm doing the one and done. I will sometimes do toy. I will sometimes do food. I will sometimes do toy again, sometimes food, and then food again, and then sometimes toy in these one and done sessions. So the dog doesn't quite know, but it knows there's hope there. My favorite thing is going to come. And because I got the buy-in by giving them the toy in these one and done in the first few times we do the one and dones, then when I do the toy, or so I do the food in the one and done once or twice, it's no big deal. The dog's happy to do it because it knows there's a probability that I'm going to get the toy that I really want. And I can do it without being, as they always make fun of me, I use the term through the moon when I may mean through the roof. But in this case, I can keep the dog in a better arousal state once I start hitting multiple odors. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would only just hit on also the idea that the dog loves to search. And that she gets over aroused while she's searching. So I might also just set up my training scenarios so that we're building up, even whether it's multiple hides or just larger search areas or whatever the thing is that is causing the dog to be over aroused. I would be starting like really slow and like making that criteria like really, really basic and then adding variables over time. So like besides just the reinforcement strategy itself, like I would be setting up my training so that like, cause Vimmy's like that too. He really just like wants to hunt and hunt and hunt. And he doesn't really want to do any of the other things. So if you're having problems with the dog passing the hide or like not performing their trained final response or something like that, I would break it down like literally like Natalie had me working Vimmy in an X pen, Exactly. So like, yes, you want to hunt, but also you have to do all these other things and that's contingent on the hunting. So, you need to make your search areas really small so that your dog can't just like blow out and get super over aroused while they're in the search area in the base case, and then slowly build out your search areas and your searching thresholds over time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. You have another one that came in for you.
All right. So how do you work on triggers, antecedents that are one of those environmental elements that are so hard to control? Presence of wildlife, horses, feral cats. Yeah. Loose dog. Yeah. So, I mean, those sometimes, like, here's the thing about trialing. You're at a trial. There's lots of things that are out of your control. The trial where there's a loose dog, like that's like, I've absolutely seen that happen. I've actually seen feral cats, like at search areas where it's like, okay, what do you do? Like, the trial hosts are trying to like do their best to manage all of those types of things. But sometimes that element of surprise can just be a lot for a dog, right? Like they're very like in their own little worlds while they're searching. And then all of a sudden this cat pops out or this like loose dog comes into your search area. Like sometimes those are completely beyond your control. And I'm not even sure if those are training issues. Like I don't know that I would manage that as a training issue, but if I have a dog who like my Doberman's very much like that, like he can find anything in the environment to be over aroused by, like there could be a piece of paper that blows by, or there could be like a gopher, like, 3 miles in the distance that he can hear that he's like now like fixated on, right? So those environmental elements are really hard to control. But really like I'm working through like ensuring that I understand my dog's reinforcement hierarchy, because I need to find the thing that's like a 9 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10 on their reinforcement scale to begin with, and then really setting them up for success. Like I know with Valor, I really need to work on small search areas where he can have a lot of like really instant success. So it's not that the hides have to be easy, but he does need to have a fairly high rate of reinforcement in those training sessions to overcome the environmental elements, right? So if he has to work a whole bunch of big searches and not have a lot of reinforcement history for those searches, his motivation just dips off and then he gets really like, into the environment really quickly. So I find if I keep his rate of reinforcement really high and I'm using his like 10 out of 10 reinforcer for those types of searches, then I'm often having more success. But it still happens that we have a feral cat in our search area. And I actually had a rabbit one day come, we were like searching in this like long, like alleyway. It was all concrete, building on one side, chain link fence on the other. And there was the timer on one end of the alley and the judge on the other. And I'm in the middle searching vehicles with my dog, and a freaking like suicidal rabbit just like ran through the middle of our search area. Like I couldn't get my dog back. I tried a food scatter. I tried feeding him food. He wouldn't eat food. Like he was like screaming at the top of his lungs, pulling me. I mean, like I just packed it in. I'm like, alert. And like, we just left their area. Right. So I don't know, Cameron, if you have anything else to add to like the environmental distractor part of it, but I think some of those surprises are just what they are on the day.
Yeah, we are actually doing something exactly what this question has brought up, which is for us, like you said, it's hard to mimic all the aspects of a trial. So, which is what the goal for Natalie was. And then my plan to help with that was, okay, so in our city, the city that I live in, there's a lot of these city parks that people go for walks with their dogs. There's big open grass fields. There's plenty of other animal activities, squirrels, birds, etc. So what we've been doing over the past couple months was setting up training in these areas, but being able to create distance from some of these things. In fact, tomorrow we're going to film her dog doing a very simple context search. So basically it's going to be pipe lineup in the park.
Yeah.
And doing something the dog knows really well, has a strong reinforcement history of this is a lot of fun, which is the tubes or the boxes. And we put that in that environment, which is a little more distracting. So adding something with really good history of reinforcement and then putting it in the environment that has some just significant distractors in it, but not over the top. So again, we're isolating and creating some distance, and we're isolating the problem, which is distraction, but we're creating some distance, lowering variables, and then adding something with really strong value and history for reinforcement to it. And again, we're doing very short reps. It's maybe 2 or 3 reps max. Dog's really bought in, and then we let the dog go do something it wants to go do in that environment, but that's done after that. So again, part of that pre-MAC principle, we're, hey, do this for me, then you get to go do this other thing or go sniff. Like, Natalie her thing is go play in the environment after the dog has done the thing that she wants. And we're, like you said earlier in your lecture, we're building it out slowly. And so our first step is greater distance from the distractors, working in closer distractors, then of course using things with high, strong reinforcement history, such as boxes, package, or for us, the pipes and so forth. And then we'll phase those away, put the hide back in the normal environment, but we're going to be back further again, and then working our way closer to these distractions. The biggest thing that you mentioned that most people do is they don't operate at the pace that the dog gave them permission to operate in, which means they weren't patient enough. They kind of rushed through. And before you know it, you've done a lot of conflicting things because, you're a new handler. You may not notice these things. Maybe the trainer didn't notice it. Whatever it is, basically we moved too fast. And now we got to pump the brakes, go back, lower the variables, and then lower the criteria for reinforcements. That way reinforcements at a higher rate, and then work our way through it. So that's the advice that kind of matches what you said. What I would do specifically for this actual question, which is go to a place where some of these things might be, such as a park or, you could go to a number of different places. It's kind of
like a public area, like you're bound to run into some of these things, right?
Absolutely. And there is where if I can create distance and then take something of really, I might even just start off with toy searches. I won't even do odor. I may just do fun primary searches. Go search for your thing that you love. And then build, like you said, take something of really high value, throw that in there, and it mimics what we're looking for, but we're not doing odor at that moment. We're just doing something fun in an environment that has some pretty strong distractions in it, and see if we can even manage that.
And sometimes my dog can't even, Valor sometimes can't eat food in a new environment. So for sure, even searching for boxes where he knows what the game is and he's got tons of reinforcement history for that. If I can't even get him to eat food in the new environment, then my goose is
crazy. For sure.
So, I got to take that time and just
Absolutely.
Go at his own pace and work him back up to the point where he can go to a box, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
So next question, does giving a direct versus indirect reward affect arousal level? Delivery service versus come get it for me. I try to do both, but should I try one more than the other to affect? You are probably going to know this best. You know your dog. Does the dog get lots of satisfaction from coming to you and engaging with you with the reward item, or does the dog really buy into you delivering it at source? I think it's very smart that you're balancing it out. And if you see an uptick in one over the other, then you just need to manage it accordingly. but this answer is going to be very specific to your dog. And then the key point for you is just seeing, is there one that drives the dog or gets the dog really motivated over the other one? And if that motivation, let's just say it's indirect and coming to you is really satisfying, I would withhold that one until my last rep, if that was the case, or vice versa, if it was the other way around. If there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, that's exactly how I would have answered it. But I was just kind of thinking as you were talking that, like, I think sometimes the dog's understanding of the marker cue will also influence the arousal. So like if you just started your room service or delivery service marker and maybe your dog doesn't really have a clear understanding of it yet, maybe it hasn't been like reinforced a lot, and then you have just been doing a lot of like reinforcement where the dog's coming to you, that might just create more arousal because the dog has clarity for that marker versus the room service cue. And you might see that change over time as your dog has like more clarity around the cue itself. But again, it kind of just depends on the dog. I know for my dogs, definitely the movement of coming to access reinforcement definitely increases arousal.
Yeah, for sure. And like, some dogs just love, they've really bought into that signal. They love the engagement they get depending on what the reward item is. Obviously, a lot of our herding type dogs really love engagement and play and vigorous play and things like that. So if odor becomes the thing, of course, that we want them to find, and they know that triggers whatever the marker signal is, then there might be some loading, which means we might see some. This is one of the things that we're going to be doing next year extensively, specifically with Michael Ellis, is going over the ways to communicate rewarding in front of you with a signal, but then also rewarding at me with a separate signal. One of these is going to be tactile. The other one's going to be obviously an audible. And the cool thing about that is we'll be showing people how to proof through this. So that way your movements won't matter, so that way you can walk in, maybe you're going to touch, maybe you're not going to touch, maybe you're going to walk in, walk back, and then give a signal and have the dog come to you. Sometimes you walk up, touch, and reward in front of them. But now, because the dog has to think that both are possible, it really cements the behavior that we want, which is whatever that, if it's stare at source or sit, whatever it is. It becomes more clear because just like anything else, when you teach obedience, we don't always put the dog in, let's say, a down position and then always recall them to us because, of course, within no time at all, that's going to degrade and they're going to come running to us. So by having two, it'll allow the dog to go, okay, I know the best option is waiting here. And then through our proofing mechanisms will become, the behavior becomes stronger, actually. So
well, I look forward to watching.
Yeah, it'll be lots of fun one. We're going to do that. We're going to do some obedience for detection. So yeah, there's a lot of little things on the agenda that we have to get through. I have to stop traveling so much so we can actually get to it.
Right. So that would be the first step.
Yeah, exactly. Another question. Any thoughts on using massage between fines during a trial, reduce arousal? I mean, I'm all for what works. Obviously, trial is going to, if you have to stop and do some type of physical touch, massage, etc. I mean, if you're doing this because you love doing it with your dog, you don't necessarily care about the time and things like that, by all means, do what you got to do. If you are an avid competitor, then this would be a time concern. And then I hand this definitely off to you, Tamara, because this is your world where you work in quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I would initially agree with you too, like from the time factor, like I'm competitive, so I'm all like, ooh, that's going to take some time. But maybe like you could use it if you are concerned about time. You could use it maybe between runs. Like, so if you're doing components back to back, for example, and like while you're moving from one staging area to the next, or, waiting at the start line for the judge, you could maybe do something like that. But I would definitely, no matter how you decide to use this, definitely practice it like all the other strategies and make sure you put this strategy along the scale of arousal for your dog. Because for my dog, touch is not soothing. he gets super escalated. Like as soon as I start putting my hands on him, he'll ramp up. Like he starts whining and he starts shaking and he jumps up on me. Like, so petting my dog isn't a soothing experience for him. So whatever you decide to do with this, whether you use it in the search area or whether you're going to just use it between staging, between components, I would definitely recommend practicing it as a strategy, because if you just do this for the first time in the search area, your dog might be like, what is happening right now, right? Yeah. It's not something that they're expecting. So like all the other strategies, make sure that you understand where it lies on the scale of arousal and practice it in your training.
Yeah, and I'll add one more thing that ends up being a complete teaser for what we were just talking about. So one of the things that we'll be going into and what I was just mentioning is the contact. So basically, after the dog makes the find, has the reward, we're teaching a contact signal, which means lean into me, just the dog basically comes into a position and kind of does a contact, like leans their shoulder into my leg or whatever. And we use that as a reset. And then that allows us to pivot or position the dog to go find the next one. But by having that sequence, it creates a little bit of a delay, but not a big one. So the dog makes a find, we mark and reward, the dog comes into a touch contact. We can then move forward with the dog still touching us and then push the dog out for searching again. And this is a situation based on what she asked. I can then maybe pet a little bit as I'm walking forward during that contact. And then that is another form that kind of answer that question, is it helps reduce arousal, or at least it moves or causes the dog to go into a more focused behavior, because now it's touching me. And then I'm alleviating that too, if my dog really enjoyed me petting it some, to then reset and then start the next part of the search.
Yeah, I like that strategy. And that's what I was going to say about like the dog, that's now like a behavior that the dog is doing instead of something that's being done to the dog, right? So that kind of puts the dog in more of a focused state versus just going in and petting the dog, which might either throw them off or make them, over aroused or whatever. So I like that idea. I can't wait to see what you guys do with that. It's going to be cool.
Oh yeah. There's been lots of brainstorming going on for months. And then now we have to do official things like put a storyboard together to actually create and film and make this content. So hopefully it's a patience game right now, but it will be coming out. We're actually even working with Forrest on this with some of these things. And then a bigger one in the future is also Doc Stewart Hilliard. And there's lots of ideas floating around with these cool things.
Amazing. We keep saying that all the folks at CDT are going to do like a little pilgrimage down to the school there once you guys are fixated there. So
it's going to be. I'm really bummed I'm missing out this summer when they're all getting together. Nallie's going to be there, Doc's going to be there, Forrest is going to be there, Michael's going to be there.
Yeah, I saw that. That's going to be awesome.
It's going to be crazy. So, but anyway. Well, thank you very much for doing this webinar. I know this won't be the last webinar we do with you. So everybody that has watched this, I hope you enjoyed it. And it'll, after this live event,